Welcome to Hubs and Drivers, a podcast for building product marketers, sponsored by Build Marketing. I'm Jeff Donaldson, your host. On this episode, email marketing best practices. Think about it for a minute. How much email do you get on a daily basis? In your personal account, in your business account? Chances are the volume is pretty high. We have a lot of ways to communicate with each other these days. Social media, text messaging, smartphones. But when it comes to business, email is still the preferred form of communication. So what does that mean for a building products manufacturer when it comes to planning their marketing plan? Joining us today is Julia Saunders, Account Director and Digital Strategist with Build Marketing. Julia, thanks for being here.
Happy to be here.
Absolutely. So how do you incorporate e-marketing into your marketing paradigm when it comes to a building products manufacturer?
It's a great question. I think the most compelling reason behind why you incorporate e-marketing is because it's a really easy way to stay in contact with your audience on a routine basis. People are checking their email on average 15 times per day. 55% of Americans are checking their email within an hour of waking up in the morning, which is crazy. And when you think about the marketing rule of sevens, there's on average 7 interactions with your brand before a sale is made. And I think that email is a really easy and affordable way to personalize some of those touch points along the sales journey. Email is really easy to measure, and unlike social and some newer forms of communication, a lot more people use and trust email across demographics.
And it is trackable. That's interesting, and we want to talk a little bit more about that later. How do you get started? How do you start building a program as a building products manufacturer?
I think the key thing is to think a few steps ahead along in your journey. What's your purpose? Where are you driving traffic? What do you want people to do once they get to your website? Who are you sending these emails to? Where did you acquire these leads? Where are they at in the buyer journey? And should you segment based on different demographics or priorities that they've demonstrated? I think it's important to think about who's following up if someone does demonstrate interest by clicking on an email. And then finally getting a marketing automation system in place to measure those results along the way.
Talk a little bit about a marketing automation system. That is really something that's out there that in many ways is off the shelf, that you pull off the shelf and from a digital perspective allows you to automate things, right?
Absolutely. There's a lot more affordable options out there if you are a smaller organization or just not ready to make that investment. Places like Constant Contact or MailChimp. And then there's a lot bigger platforms that can integrate with your CRM, like Salesforce has Pardot that you could use, or Marketo is another great one. So there's really a lot of different offerings all across the spectrum of how much you want to invest. And it's a great way to just automate those sends. It gives you all of that information on the email performance, who clicked, who engaged, all in one place so that you could easily view all of that performance data.
And you talked about knowing what you want your prospect to do. How critical is that in email marketing?
I think it's so important. You don't want to just be sending emails out for the sake of sending emails. That's annoying. Nobody wants that.
Right.
So I think it's important to think about what your end goal is and think about, as few clicks as you can to get people to that content or that place to convert that you can.
And we're getting into that now, best practices. Lay out a few from your perspective. What are some of the best practices when it comes to email marketing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think having a clean list is really key. You want to be looking at making sure that your list is clean every 6 to 12 months on average. It's generally not the best idea to buy your list just right off the shelf full of cold leads. You want to focus on growing slowly and organically through opt-ins just because that's going to give you the most genuine engagement. I think it's also really important to think about any kind of canned spam legislation that's in place, or there's, if you're outside the States, if you're in Canada or the UK, there's other different types of legislation that are in place. You want to make sure that you're giving people the opportunity to opt out and honoring those opt-out requests in a timely manner. And then I think just thinking about your audience, thinking about the content that they're most interested in or would find the most valuable, when they're most likely to read your email, and what they're going to find most engaging.
And what happens if you don't follow those best practices? Give us a sense of what kind of results, because you're going to be investing time in building an e-marketing program, right? And time is money. And if you're not following those best practices, what ends up being the byproduct of that?
I think it can go one of two ways. You have people who are engaging, but it's not necessarily meaningful engagement. They're not really the types of customers that you want to be focusing your time on. Or you're just not going to see that engagement whatsoever, and you're going to have just cold leads, a poor open rate, poor engagement rate, and it's not going to be worth the juice that you're putting into it.
In many cases, people who jump into e-marketing and don't follow those best practices, they get perhaps frustrated because they're not following them and they're not getting the results that they're looking for. You mentioned content. Content is key when it comes to e-marketing. Talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Content's king. We hear that all over the place. But what I would argue is more important than even the body copy of an email or the design of an email once you open it, is putting some effort into those content factors that determine whether or not your email is going to get opened in the first place. So those factors would include the subject line, the name of the sender, the pre-header or that summary text that appears in the inbox and gives you a little preview, and then also that date and time that the email is sent out. So the average open rate for a marketing email is only around 21 to 22%. That's on a good day. So on average, only a fifth of your list is even getting to the content of your email, which is crazy. And I think sometimes people forget about that. Once you do get to the content of the email, which does have its place and is certainly important, I think the most important thing is a really strong call to action, something creative, witty, or compelling that's going to drive clicks through to your website.
You mentioned earlier that email marketing is very measurable and trackable. And there are a bunch of metrics out there. Let's hit a couple of them and maybe you can give just a baseline definition so we understand it better. Click-through rate and click-to-open rate. Let's just start with those two.
So the click-through rate is the amount of people who clicked on something in the email divided by the amount of people who received the email. The click-to-open ratio is a little bit better indicator of the engagement within the email. It's the amount of people who clicked divided by the amount of people who opened.
Lot to think about when it comes to e-marketing and email marketing. Julia, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So here's an interesting statistic. According to at least one study, for every dollar you spend on email marketing, you can generate as much as $43 in ROI. Some pretty impressive statistics. Check out the show notes of this episode for a download if you'd like to learn more. That's it for this edition of Hubs and Drivers. I'm Jeff Donaldson, your host. Thanks for joining us.